What if the most feared act committed on a battlefield never happened on the battlefield at all? What if it was done by a woman who had already buried a husband, a son, and every trace of the life she once lived? That question haunted soldiers for generations, because the night the war widow acted, even her executioners hesitated. They said they saw something in her eyes that did not belong to the living, something forged in grief and sharpened by silence. And it began long before that night, in a village that existed only on maps already claimed by empires. She had no name anymore, not in the way names matter. War had stripped that from her. What remained was a woman shaped by loss, watching the fires on the horizon grow closer as conquering armies devoured everything familiar. When the soldiers arrived, they didn't find a trembling widow waiting to be spared. They found a woman who had spent months gathering stories of what happened to others like her, women forgotten by chroniclers but remembered in whispers. That was her battlefield: memory, pain, and a hunger for justice no empire could extinguish. The soldiers expected surrender. They expected tears. Instead, something else happened, something that made even hardened men step back. One executioner later claimed he felt as if he were not facing a prisoner, but an omen, a warning carved into human form. And the truth is that widows in ancient warfare were far more dangerous than history ever admitted. They held knowledge soldiers didn't have. They understood rituals neglected by strategists, and they carried a kind of fury that didn't burn. It froze. But here is the part no one saw coming. Long before her execution was ordered, she had already set something in motion. A pattern, a message, a symbol. And the deeper you look into the accounts left behind, the more you see the same details repeating across regions and eras. A candle left burning where no lantern should be. A phrase whispered by the condemned that was never recorded in official documents. A gesture made by women minutes before death, identical in empires that never met. These weren't coincidences. They were signals, warnings, a language born from women who had nothing left to lose and everything left to avenge. So when the war widow acted that night, her executioners weren't shocked by what she did. They were shocked by what it meant. They had unknowingly stepped into a ritual older than the empire they served. A ritual crafted by women who turned grief into strategy. And if you have ever wondered how silent figures on the margins of history could shape the fate of armies, then stay with me, because the truth behind her final act will challenge everything you think you know about power, loyalty, and fear. Before we go deeper, tell me something. Have you ever imagined what a single person can do when stripped of everything but purpose? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And while you're here, make sure you have liked the video and checked whether you are subscribed, because understanding this story fully begins with seeing the pieces others overlooked. Now let's follow the thread she left behind, one that leads into a darkness no empire ever controlled. What the soldiers found the next morning was not destruction, but absence. An entire settlement emptied of life, as if the people had dissolved into the night without leaving footprints. The war widow had not been the only one waiting for the empire's advance. She had simply been the one they underestimated the most. Her silence had concealed something far more deliberate. She had transformed grief into preparation long before the soldiers marched through the valley. And when they arrived, what they saw did not resemble panic or chaos. It resembled design. The massacre that reshaped her fate had begun weeks earlier when imperial scouts swept through border villages, seizing men of fighting age and marking households with black resin. Those marks meant property of the state, but for women, they meant something far worse. They meant disappearance. Soldiers claimed it was relocation, protection, reassignment. But the women left behind knew better. They knew that the empire fed on bodies the same way it fed on land, absorbing what was useful and discarding what resisted. In that world, a widow was not a survivor. She was unfinished business, The war widow had watched the process unfold with an expression the soldiers mistook for helplessness. She observed which officers issued the orders, which guards hesitated, which men avoided her eyes. She memorized the sound of each voice, the pattern of each patrol, the way decisions traveled down the chain of command until cruelty became routine. Most people broke under the weight of that knowledge. She didn't. She collected it the way others collected weapons. And when the executions began, she understood something no one else had recognized. The empire was stretched thin. That weakness became her opportunity. The same soldiers committing the massacre were terrified of failing their superiors, terrified of appearing unsure, terrified of losing control. They relied on predictability from their victims, on the usual cries, the pleas, the collapse into fear. But she denied them that script. She denied them the familiar rhythm of domination. Instead of resisting physically, she resisted psychologically. She stood too straight. She spoke too little. She looked too long into their faces. It unnerved them in ways they could not articulate. Then came the moment none of them expected. When the officer in charge declared that all widows were to be processed at dawn, she stepped forward, not to beg, not to protest, but to ask a single question in a voice that carried through the courtyard. "Do you know what becomes of the ones you leave alive?" The soldiers laughed, but not comfortably. The officer dismissed her words as a delusion of the grieving. Yet several soldiers later admitted they felt something shift, like a thread tightening behind their thoughts. By nightfall, tension hung heavier than smoke. The troops had executed dozens, but unease spread through the ranks like an infection. Something about her had unsettled the narrative they were accustomed to. In their world, victims reacted, but the war widow anticipated. Victims screamed, but she observed. Victims surrendered, but she waited. And that is why, when they finally dragged her toward the designated pit where other women had been thrown, several executioners hesitated. Not because they feared her strength, but because they feared her purpose. They sensed, without understanding, that she had already done something they had not detected, something that extended far beyond her own survival. They would discover soon enough that the massacre had not ended the story. It had awakened it. The soldiers believed fear weakened women. What they never understood was that fear shaped them. For every village burned, every husband lost, every body buried without rites, women learned to adapt their sorrow into something the empire could not measure. Rituals that once honored the dead slowly became rituals that preserved the living. And among them, widows were the most transformed of all. They carried memories like blades concealed beneath cloth, sharpened by grief and handled with extraordinary precision. The war widow belonged to a long lineage of women who learned to survive not by fleeing violence, but by studying it. She had attended the rituals of mourning not as a passive participant, but as a strategist. She had watched how other widows moved through each stage of loss, how silence replaced tears, how gestures passed between them, tiny, nearly invisible, yet heavy with meaning. Grief, she learned, had a pattern. And inside that pattern was power. These women understood something soldiers never questioned. Death was not the end of influence. The empire's executions created widows, but widows created consequences. A woman stripped of her family did not simply vanish into despair. She saw the world differently. Rules no longer protected her. Shame no longer constrained her. Punishment no longer frightened her. The empire thought these women were hollowed out. In truth, they were ungoverned. On the night before her execution, the war widow performed a ritual banned decades earlier by imperial decree. She knelt in the dust, palms open, and whispered the names of every person taken from her. It was not prayer. It was inventory, an accounting of loss that clarified purpose. Other women watched her, recognizing the fragments of a tradition their mothers had carried in secret. It was a ritual meant to stabilize the mind before punishment, to transform terror into focus. The soldiers who guarded them saw none of this. They assumed grief had broken the women, that their stillness meant surrender. But psychologists, centuries later, would identify something different in the accounts: collective dissociation used as resistance. By aligning their breathing, mirroring each other's posture, and repeating memorized phrases, the women stabilized themselves emotionally while destabilizing their captors. A silent rebellion executed through discipline rather than force. The widow's eyes had changed by then. Not wild, not hopeless, precise. She watched the guards in the same way she had once watched her husband sharpen his blade. Before battle, she studied their habits, their fatigue, which ones argued, which ones obeyed without question. She knew exactly when the officers would change shifts, how long it took them to finish counting captives, how often they glanced toward the hills where smoke still drifted from burning homes. What the Empire dismissed as feminine frailty was in reality accumulated intelligence. The women had charted the soldiers' vulnerabilities with the calm of scholars, and in the moments before dawn, as the executions resumed, something unexpected happened among the widows. They began to subtly align themselves in a pattern the Empire had forgotten, a geometric formation older than the dynasty ruling them. It centered the body, protected the mind, and readied the will. The war widow stood at its center, not because she sought leadership, but because the others recognized a force she did not fully understand herself. Their grief had converged into something collective, something the Empire had no language for. And when the executioners approached, expecting broken women, they found a silent formation that unsettled them more than screams ever could. What occurred next would reveal why these rituals had survived in secret, and why the Empire had once feared them enough to outlaw them. What the soldiers witnessed next was so unexpected that several later swore the air itself shifted. They had marched into the courtyard prepared for routine executions, repeating orders they had carried out in dozens of villages before this one. But the widows standing before them did not look like prisoners awaiting death. They looked like participants in a ceremony the Empire had forgotten, but their ancestors had not. The geometric formation they held was subtle, almost accidental to an untrained eye, but to anyone who understood the old rituals of border tribes, it meant something unmistakable: collective intent. The executioners hesitated, not because they feared sorcery or rebellion, but because the widows were too calm. Discipline, when expressed by the condemned, unnerves even the most hardened soldier. One guard gripped his spear tighter, convinced they were preparing to lunge, yet none moved. Instead, the war widow lifted her chin, as if acknowledging invisible witnesses. It wasn't defiance, it was declaration. When the officer barked the order to begin, the widows did not collapse into panic. They breathed together, slow, steady, as though their lives were synchronized by a rhythm deeper than fear. Several soldiers later said it felt like stepping into a place they were never meant to be. And then came the moment that fractured the logic of the Empire's execution ritual. The war widow took one step forward. That single movement broke the line between captor and captive. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't resisting. She was observing them, evaluating the men who believed themselves to hold absolute authority. Her gaze moved from face to face, lingering just long enough for each soldier to feel as though she saw something he had tried to hide: shame, hesitation, doubt. It was disarming in a way violence could never be. Then she spoke, not loudly, not emotionally, but with a clarity that cut through the courtyard like steel. She repeated a phrase from a ritual banned generations earlier, a phrase whispered only by women who had lost everything. The living carry the debt of the fallen. None of the soldiers understood the words, but they understood the effect. The other widows echoed her in perfect unison. The sound wasn't loud, but it vibrated, layered with cadence and composure, unsettling the very men trained to suppress panic. For the first time, the executioners looked unsure. Their cruelty relied on chaos, on screams, on the predictable collapse of the condemned. But this silent orchestration of grief felt like an accusation delivered in a language the Empire tried to erase. Even the officer faltered, his voice cracking as he repeated the command. And still, the women did not break. What made the soldiers step back wasn't fear of revolt. It was the realization that these women had prepared for this moment long before their village fell. Their ritual wasn't an attempt to survive, it was a final act of autonomy. A last message sent through behavior instead of weaponry. A way of saying, "You may decide how we die, but not who we are when we face you." When the officer finally raised his hand to signal the beginning of the executions, several soldiers shifted their weight in discomfort, as though their bodies resisted the command. They were no longer carrying out punishment. They were witnessing something they couldn't categorize, an ancient pattern resurfacing in the shadow of imperial authority. And what the war widow did in the next heartbeat, just before the first blade lifted, would imprint itself into the memory of every man who stood there. Before we continue, tell me something in the comments. What do you think these soldiers saw in her that made them hesitate, even for a moment? What the soldiers saw in that moment was not resistance. It was intention. A kind of controlled stillness that suggested she had been waiting for this exact intersection of time, place, and witnesses. The war widow did not flinch when the blades rose. Instead, she lifted her hand with a precision that made the gesture look rehearsed. Her fingers curled inward, tracing a symbol so old that even the Empire scholars barely remembered its meaning. But the executioners recognized it instinctively, the way human instinct recognizes fire before understanding its source. The gesture was a warning, not a threat, not a plea, something more unsettling. A message that implied the widows had prepared for consequences beyond death. Several soldiers paused, convinced the women were about to unleash something physical, a weapon, a hidden blade, a coordinated attack. But nothing moved except the widows, hand carving invisible meaning into the air. The silence thickened until it felt almost ceremonial. Then she began to walk, not toward the executioners, but along the line of widows behind her, each woman lowering her head as the war widow passed, as though acknowledging a ritual authority none of them had spoken aloud. She stopped at the last woman in the row, an elder whose face bore the kind of grief that no empire could manufacture. The war widow placed both hands on the elder's shoulders, closing her eyes for a brief moment. The soldiers felt a shift they could not explain. Something like a transfer, something like a vow. When she stepped back into place, the formation tightened around her, not in fear, but in structure, like a unit aligning before a battle. It was then the soldiers finally understood. The widows were not reacting to the Empire's violence. They were executing a strategy built from rituals the Empire had dismissed as superstition. These rituals were never about mourning. They were about preserving identity under domination, and identity, when channeled through collective desperation, becomes a weapon. The officer barked the order again, louder, angrier, trying to regain control of a moment slipping through his grasp. But his voice wavered. He sensed, the way prey senses the shift in a predator's breathing, that the situation had changed. The power dynamic he relied on had fractured. He looked at the war widow, expecting terror. Instead, she gazed back, with something closer to recognition, as though she had already seen how this moment would be remembered. What the soldiers did not know was that widows like her carried techniques passed through generations not in writing, but in posture, eye contact, breathing patterns. These techniques destabilized aggressors by refusing to play the roles assigned to them. The Empire believed violence was linear: apply force, receive submission. But the war widow had been shaped by a world where grief was circular, where the dead remained present, where silence had weight. As she inhaled, the other widows followed, synchronizing again, their alignment so precise that one soldier muttered a prayer under his breath. It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't magic. It was psychology older than the Empire. Women had survived countless invasions long before this dynasty existed. They had learned how to move their suffering into places authority could not reach. And just as the executioners prepared to advance, something happened that none of them could have predicted. The war widow shifted her stance. Not aggressive, not submissive, balanced, as though preparing for a moment that required absolute stability. She held the gaze of the officer and spoke 5 words in a calm, deliberate tone. Words that would later spread through barracks as rumor, through villages as warning, through archives as an enigma carved into the margins of forgotten reports. There are more than you see. It was not a threat, but a reminder of stories unrecorded, of women unaccounted for, of consequences the Empire had never learned to anticipate. And in the heartbeat that followed, every soldier understood that the executions were no longer a simple act of order. They had become the spark of something the Empire was not prepared to confront. The officer wanted to dismiss her words as desperation, but something in the war widow's tone made denial impossible. It was not a boast, not bravado, not the last flare of defiance before defeat. It sounded like observation, a plain and unsettling truth. And for the first time since the campaign began, the soldiers felt the ground beneath their certainty shift. They were used to enemies they could quantify: rebels, bandits, militias. But this was different. This was an implication that the Empire had misread the entire landscape of resistance. Still, procedure demanded continuation. The officer signaled the executioners forward. Blades lifted. Dust rose around their boots. Yet movement stalled again. Not because the widows resisted, but because something else was happening behind the soldiers. Quiet, almost imperceptible, but strong enough to disrupt instinct. Several men sensed it before they turned. A vibration in the air. A presence. At the top of the ridge overlooking the courtyard, silhouettes began to appear. Not armed fighters, not villagers. Women. Dozens of them. Possibly more. Cloaked, veiled, each standing in absolute stillness. The soldiers had scoured the region for survivors, yet these women had emerged without a sound, as if stepping out from the earth itself. The officer's breath caught. This was not a rebellion. This was a gathering. The war widow did not look at them. She didn't need to. Her statement, "There are more than you see," had not been metaphor. It had been preparation. The Empire believed it understood how communities fractured under violence. It assumed widows dispersed, isolated by grief, weakened by loss. But the truth was older than imperial doctrine. When men fell, women convened. These silent figures on the ridge were not armed, but their presence was a weapon the soldiers were unequipped to interpret. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a line that stretched farther than the executioners could count. Some were elders with braided hair wrapped in cloth soaked with ash. Others were younger, faces streaked with the dust of long travel. All had gathered for a purpose larger than the, widow at the center of the courtyard. The officer barked orders, but his voice no longer commanded obedience. The formation on the ridge didn't advance, didn't shout, didn't threaten. They simply existed, unbroken, unafraid. Something primal in the soldiers recoiled at the sight. Armies could crush armies, but this was not an army. It was a memory made visible, a lineage stepping out of silence. The war widow finally lifted her gaze toward the ridge, and though she spoke no words, the signal was unmistakable. The women on the ridge raised their hands in the same gesture the widow had drawn in the air earlier, slow, deliberate, synchronized. The executioners froze. The officer felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. These women had not come to fight. They had come to witness. And witnessing was more dangerous than resistance. Witnesses carried stories. Witnesses shaped legends. Witnesses turned punishment into martyrdom, sorrow into power. The empire ruled by controlling narrative. These women were reclaiming it simply by being present. The soldiers realized too late that they had become participants in a ritual designed to expose their brutality, not hide it. The officer stepped back. Not far, but enough for doubt to take hold among his men. The widows at the center remained still, their breathing as steady as the lines of women above. The entire courtyard felt suspended, caught in a moment where violence no longer guaranteed authority. And that was when the War Widow moved once more, slowly, deliberately, forcing every soldier to reevaluate what they believed was happening. The next action she took. That was the moment none of them would ever be able to erase. What she did next was so subtle that the executioners didn't register it at first. The War Widow lowered her hands, let them fall to her sides, and exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she had carried for far too long. That single breath shifted the mood of the entire courtyard. It was not surrender. It was permission. A signal that the moment had transitioned from imperial ritual to something entirely governed by her terms. Then she stepped forward again, not toward the officer this time, but toward the youngest of the executioners, a boy barely old enough to shave, his knuckles white around the handle of his blade. His breath hitched as she approached. She didn't tower over him. She didn't threaten him. She simply stood close enough that he could see the grief etched into her face and the certainty beneath it. She lifted her hand, not to strike, but to gently touch her own heart. Then she pointed to his. A gesture so human, so disarming, it bypassed the hardened layers of training drilled into every soldier. The boy blinked. His grip loosened. Something inside him faltered. And in that instant, every executioner realized the same terrifying truth. The woman standing before them no longer feared death. She feared nothing they could take from her. The officer spat, a command for the boy to step back. But as the order echoed across the courtyard, the widows behind her mirrored her gesture, hand to heart, then extended outward. A wave of deliberate unity. The women on the ridge did the same, their silhouettes moving with synchronized precision that made the soldiers' skin prickle. It felt rehearsed, ancient, undeniably intentional. This was no rebellion. It was indictment. The officer's jaw clenched. He knew the Empire was watching through the eyes of its soldiers. Any hesitation on his part could be interpreted as weakness. Yet every instinct screamed that forcing the execution now would lay the foundation for something the Empire feared more than uprisings. Myth. If these women died in silence under the gaze of hundreds more, their deaths would not disappear into records. They would become power. The War Widow turned her back to the soldiers, a shocking gesture, one no captive should ever dare. She faced the ridge of women, and for several seconds the courtyard was suspended in a silence thick enough to bend thought itself. The soldiers realized with dread that she had shifted the meaning of this scene. They were no longer her executioners. They were her witnesses. When she turned back, her expression was utterly transformed. Not calm, not resigned, but resolute, as if she had just accepted a task larger than her own survival. She spoke again, her voice steady. Let those who see remember. It was enough to destabilize the final thread of imperial dominance. The officer shouted for his men to restrain her, but several executioners hesitated. The boy stepped backward entirely, dropping his blade. Another executioner averted his gaze, unable to meet the widow's eyes. The formation on the ridge tightened. Their presence now felt less like an audience and more like a verdict. The war widow's final gesture that night was not rebellion, but devotion. She knelt in the dust with the dignity of someone performing a sacred rite. Her posture grounded the other widows, who mirrored her once more. The courtyard pulsed with a strange, quiet power, born not from violence, but from absolute clarity. What happened in the next moments would carve itself into imperial memory for decades, haunting every soldier who survived that night. Before we move forward, share something with me in the comments. What do you think the soldiers feared most at this point, the women, or what their presence meant? The moment the war widow knelt, something fractured inside the imperial script. The executioners had been trained to dominate through spectacle, to choreograph death into a demonstration of authority. But now, the courtyard felt inverted, as though the ritual belonged not to the empire, but to the widows themselves. The soldiers stood frozen, blades raised yet useless, as the kneeling figure redefined the meaning of the space around her. For the first time since the campaign began, the power dynamic had reversed without a single weapon being lifted. The officer attempted to regain control with a sharp, barked command, but his voice broke the silence in a way that revealed more fear than authority. His men sensed it. Discipline relies on certainty. Uncertainty spreads like wildfire. As the soldiers shifted uneasily, their armor clinked just enough to betray their hesitation. And then came the subtle detail that pushed their nerves to the edge. The widow's breathing. Perfectly synchronized again. Slow. Measured. Deliberate. It was as though they were preparing for something the soldiers could not see, something neither physical nor chaotic, but ritualistic. The officer clenched his teeth. Rituals were dangerous. Rituals meant identity, continuity, memory. And the Empire feared memory more than rebellion because memory could outlive swords. The widows on the ridge remained motionless, yet the sense of pressure they exerted was undeniable. Few soldiers had ever witnessed a silent assembly of women in such numbers. Most imperial campaigns encountered scattered survivors, individuals who could be subdued or absorbed, but this gathering felt intentional, coordinated, as though called together by something older than law. The war widow lifted her head slowly. No theatrical defiance, no sign of despair, just an unbearable steadiness. She looked directly at the officer, not with hatred, but with recognition, as if she understood exactly how far his authority extended and where it ended. Then she placed one hand on the ground beside her, pressing her palm into the dust. The other widows followed, creating a ripple of movement that unsettled even the most hardened soldiers. This gesture had appeared in scattered reports from earlier conquests, always dismissed as meaningless, a remnant of tribal superstition. But scholars much later would identify it as something far more sophisticated, a ritual of anchoring. It meant the women were binding the moment, marking it as part of a lineage of resistance. They were declaring that what happened here would not vanish into silence. The officer realized it too late. His instinct to stop the ritual collided with the soldiers' growing reluctance. Several executioners could not seem to approach. Their boots felt heavy. Their hands trembled. The youngest among them whispered that he felt watched, even though the widows had not moved. One veteran soldier muttered that he had fought in 3 campaigns and never felt such dread. Another crossed himself reflexively, forgetting that imperial doctrine forbade personal rituals during executions. Then the war widow's voice returned, soft, but carrying across the courtyard as though carried by something larger. She spoke not to the soldiers, but to the women behind her. A short phrase, old enough to predate imperial borders. The widows echoed it, their voices layering like wind traveling through stone corridors. The meaning of the phrase was lost to the Empire, but the effect was not. Every soldier felt it. It was not a threat. It was a vow. A vow that implied this moment would ignite something beyond their understanding, that violence could not erase what ritual preserved. And as the officer raised his arm in a final attempt to force the execution forward, several of his own men stepped back, refusing to cross the distance between themselves and the kneeling women. They would only understand later that this hesitation was the turning point, the exact moment control slipped irretrievably from Imperial hands. The hesitation of the soldiers did not go unnoticed by the officer. In fact, it terrified him more than the widow's ritual. Armies fall not when enemies strike, but when discipline fractures from within. And the fracture had already begun. The officer attempted once more to assert control, but his voice cracked, barely perceptible, yet devastatingly symbolic. Authority that wavers, even for a heartbeat, becomes a wound that spreads quickly through the ranks. The widows did not exploit the hesitation in any physical way. They simply remained still, palms pressed into the dust, breaths aligned. Their restraint unsettled the soldiers far more than any attack could have. Panic thrives on unpredictability, but here the terror came from the opposite. A terrifying, deliberate order. A structure the soldiers could not decipher. A choreography they had not been trained to counter. The officer barked a threat meant to jolt his men back into obedience, but it only deepened their reluctance. One executioner stepped back again, muttering that something felt wrong, though he could not articulate why. Another lowered his blade unconsciously. A third kept glancing at the ridge, where the silent line of women seemed to stretch farther than before, as though more had arrived without making a sound. And then came the breaking point. A faint tremor, whether from the wind or from the synchronized exhale of hundreds of women, passed across the courtyard. The soldiers reacted instinctively, turning toward its source, hands tightening on weapons. But the tremor had not come from outside. It came from within them. A destabilizing recognition. This was no longer an execution. It was a reckoning. The Empire had expected compliance. What it encountered instead was a force carved from memory and ritual, shaped by generations of women who survived long enough to understand the one truth empires always forgot. People who have lost everything are capable of anything. But these widows were not reckless. They were intentional. They did not seek to win through violence. They sought to outlast through meaning. The war widow rose from the ground slowly, each movement deliberate enough to draw every gaze in the courtyard. Dust clung to her palms. Her knees were coated with earth, but her posture was unbroken. She stood like someone who had just completed a rite, rather than someone awaiting execution. She looked at each soldier in turn, not with vengeance, but with comprehension. She saw their fear, their uncertainty, their unraveling faith in the imperial order. Then the elder widow behind her stood, then another, and another. A wave of movement that traveled through the group with a rhythm as old as the ritual they had invoked. On the ridge, the line of women shifted as well, stepping forward in perfect unison. The sound of hundreds of feet pressing into the earth was soft, almost gentle, but to the soldiers, it felt like thunder. The officer panicked. He shouted for the archers. He shouted for restraints. He shouted for the widows to be forced back into compliance. But the soldiers did not move. They were paralyzed not by physical threat, but by the realization that this scene would echo far beyond the courtyard. They understood now. If they killed these women under the eyes of so many witnesses, they would not erase rebellion. They would create legend. And empires are far more afraid of legends than uprisings. The war widow raised her hand once more, drawing the same ancient symbol in the air. This time the soldiers recognized it immediately as ritual, not coincidence. Her fingers cut through the space with slow precision, marking a moment that was no longer theirs to control. She was engraving meaning onto the air, onto the earth, onto their memory. The soldiers felt it. This was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of the Empire's fear. And they had no idea how quickly that fear would spread once word of this night reached the outer provinces. Long after the war widow lifted her hand, the courtyard existed in a kind of suspended reality. The soldiers stood immobilized, caught between the orders they had been trained to obey and the shifting current of something older, deeper, far more enduring than imperial doctrine. The women on the ridge stepped forward again, just slightly, yet the effect was seismic. Their presence no longer felt symbolic. It felt strategic. Each footstep carried the weight of generations who had survived the violence of men, of empires, of wars that changed nothing except the names of the dead. The officer shouted until his voice broke, but authority drained from him like water from a cracked vessel. His men no longer looked to him for guidance. They looked at the women, at the war widow, at the ritual unfolding in silence. And that silence had become the true center of power. It swallowed every command, every threat, every attempt to reassert control. Empires depend on obedience, but obedience depends on belief. And belief had just shifted sides. The war widow moved toward the center of the courtyard. Dust lifted around her feet, catching the dying light. She stretched out her hands, palms open, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement of those who had come to witness. Every widow behind her mirrored the gesture. Those on the ridge did too. 300 women, perhaps more, forming a single unified presence that radiated, something soldiers had no language for. That was when the officer understood. This night would not die with the women. It would travel. Through whispers, through symbols, through families torn apart by war who needed a story that reminded them they were not powerless. A single act could be forgotten, but a ritual repeated by many could reshape history. He realized he was standing not in the aftermath of rebellion, but in the birth of narrative. The war widow lowered her hands. The formation tightened, breaths aligned once more. She spoke only one sentence, but it carried through the courtyard with the clarity of a bell carved from bone. What is taken from us returns in another form. The meaning escaped the soldiers, yet the tone was unmistakable. It was not prophecy. It was instruction. The ridge of women responded in unison, a sound like wind shifting through an ancient structure. Low, resonant, steady. It traveled across the courtyard, through armor, through skin, into memory. Even the most seasoned soldiers felt something inside them tremble, a recognition that power was not always sharp or loud. Sometimes it was quiet, cumulative, inevitable. Then the widows stood perfectly still. No movement, no defiance, no plea, just presence. And presence, when embodied by so many who had already survived the unbearable, became a force the Empire had no method for containing. The officer finally lowered his own weapon, not out of mercy, but out of understanding. Whatever happened next would not erase this moment. The war widow had already transformed a simple execution into a fracture in imperial certainty, a story too potent to silence, a pattern destined to reappear wherever grief and resolve met in the shadows of collapsing institutions. And for anyone who listens carefully, echoes of that night still appear in forgotten records, in symbols etched into prison walls, in songs sung by women whose names never made it into official histories. Because what the war widow created was not rebellion, it was continuity. If you reached this point, let me know in the comments with the phrase, "I stayed until the end." It helps me understand who felt the weight of this story. And if this narrative resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel. It ensures you do not miss the next chapter in these forgotten histories. A like on the video also supports the work of bringing these buried stories back into light. And if you want to go even deeper, there is a video waiting beside this one that expands on the hidden patterns shaping power across ancient empires. Follow the thread and continue the journey with me.